In the previous video, we talked about the Russian Revolution. Now, in this new episode, we're going to talk about the Soviets, which is the Russian word for the workers' councils. The Soviets began to be organized during the 1905 revolution as working-class fighting bodies that centralized strikes and led them. During the 1917 February Revolution, the Soviets were organized again and quickly incorporated representatives of the army battalions, both from the cities and the front lines. The organization was renamed the Council of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies. What has that got to do with Trotsky? It has a lot to do with him because Trotsky chaired the first Soviet in 1905 and returned to lead the Petrograd Soviet shortly before the October Revolution. Between February and October 1917, the Soviets, as well as being organs of struggle, began to take on tasks that the provisional governments and the state were unable to solve, such as the supply of food and fuel in the cities. Actually, a dual power began to be formed. On the one hand, the provisional government, and on the other, the Soviets. The bourgeois government of Kerensky, the last provisional government, was overthrown by the Soviets, already with the Bolshevik majority, in October 1917. The Soviets then dissolved the institutions of the bourgeois government, which in practice were already paralyzed, and they did not function. They dissolved the police, they dissolved the command of the armed forces, they dissolved the judiciary, they did away with these institutions. At that moment, the situation of dual power comes to an end. The bourgeois power is defeated and destroyed, and new power takes over. The power of workers, soldiers, and peasants represented by the Soviets. All the institutions of the old Tsarist state were replaced by the Soviets, which took over their functions. A new body, the Council of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies, accumulated the three aspects of the former state, both the executive government and the legislature, because it issued decrees and passed new laws, and the judiciary. It created new organs of government, a Red Guard and also a Red Army, to replace the old Tsarist army. The deputies of the Soviet had no fixed terms of office and could be replaced by the workers at any time. Furthermore, they could not earn more than a skilled worker, and also all high state officials followed the same rule. The foundations of this type of state were based on the lessons Lenin mainly had drawn from the Paris Commune, from the experience of the Paris Commune. And eventually the Bolsheviks achieved what the Paris Commune could not achieve, because the Paris Commune was massacred by the bourgeois forces in 1871. The Soviets were very flexible and extremely democratic bodies. Their representatives were elected in the workplaces, mainly in the factories, with a ratio of about one representative for every 500 workers. The bourgeoisie, who lived by exploiting the labor of their employees, and also those who lived on the rent, could not vote. Only the workers could elect their representatives. The reporter John Reed, who wrote an extraordinary book about the Russian Revolution called 10 Days That Shook the World, which I recommend, and is very easy to find in bookshops, also wrote an article called Soviets in Action, where he explains how these councils worked. In that article he explains, the Petrograd Soviet may serve as an example. It consisted of about 1,200 deputies, and in normal circumstances held a plenary session every 2 weeks. In the meantime, it elected a central executive committee of 110 members, based upon party proportionality. Besides the big city Soviet, there were also the Raiori, or ward Soviets. These were made up of the deputies elected from each ward to the city Soviet, and administered their part of the city. So we can see that the Petrograd Soviet took over the tasks of city government based on its central executive committee, and each ward Soviet also administered its respective constituency. John Reed explains in more detail what representation was like within the Soviet. He says, elections of delegates were based on proportional representation, which means that the political parties are represented in exact proportion to the number of voters in the whole city, and it is political parties and programs which are voted for, not candidates. This workers' government, which institutes a new type of state, the state which destroys bourgeois institutions and builds new workers' institutions, totally democratic, it is a condition for advancing in the direction of socialism. Therefore, it is completely false, by the way. We must say it's a complete nonsense, this campaign of the right wing that says that Venezuela, Nicaragua, and even Brazil were socialist countries, only because they had left parties in government. Those parties that call themselves leftists do not defend socialism anymore, nor were those countries socialist at any time. Indeed, those countries have not even started on a road towards socialism. Those very parties that call themselves leftists, like, for example, the Brazilian Workers' Party, in reality made governments in alliance with the bourgeoisie, defended the institutions of the bourgeois state, and even strengthened them. Well, in these brief considerations, we talked about the state that the working class need to begin to build socialism. Now, coming back to the role of the Soviets in the Russian Revolution in 1917, which is our subject, it should be stressed that these councils played a very important role in the organization of the economy, and then in the decisions that the new worker state had to take in relation to that. During the year 1917, in the 8 months between February and October, factory committees were formed in every industry. These committees controlled production, fought the sabotage that the bosses carried out during those months, and even took over the management of the enterprise when their bosses fled the country. In other words, the factory committees exercised real workers' control over the factories. After the October Revolution of 1917, the Bolsheviks did not immediately expropriate bourgeois ownership of the means of production. However, the increasing abandonment of the factories by the bosses, the attempts at sabotage of production, and also the closure of several factories led the Bolsheviks to expropriate all the means of production towards the end of 1918. From then on, the new worker state began to lay the foundations for the structuring of its economy, collective ownership of the means of production in the first place, secondly, the monopoly of foreign trade, and finally, the beginning of the planning of the economy. But what has Trotsky got to do with all this? Trotsky, as a revolutionary Marxist and socialist, always argued that a real socialist revolution can only be made upon the destruction of the bourgeois state, the building of a new workers' state based on the Soviets, and the expropriation of the bourgeoisie to establish a new economy based on the collective ownership of the means of production. I don't have the slightest doubt that Trotsky would find it utterly stupid to think that Venezuela, let alone Brazil, could be socialist countries where the bourgeoisie was not even expropriated, where private property remains the mainstay of the economy.
Aucune force ne pourra nous détacher l'avant-garde prolétarienne internationale. Les idées et les méthodes de Marx et de Lénine deviendront les idées et les méthodes internationales.
In the next episode, we're going to approach the civil war in Russia, which lasted from 1918 to 1922, and Trotsky's role as founder and leader of the Red Army. If you missed the previous episodes, log on to our channel, watch it, and be sure to subscribe.